let me just, yeah, this will work. Well, all right. Today, I'm going to talk about ethics and how probability plays a role in it. And I could have used a different title. I could have called this Uncertainty in Ethics, because I'm going to, unlike the last talk I gave, I'm going to avoid the mathematics here. I'm not going to get into any calculations or any derivations of any kind. So this will be merely a brief general overview of how uncertainty or probability affects ethics. In preparing for this, I discovered that it would be very easy to do a whole course on this subject. You could easily have a series of a dozen or so lectures that went into all the various areas where probability affects ethics. But I'm just going to give a brief overview. I'm not going to go into any one area in any extreme detail. So I hope this raises a lot of questions for you and will lead you to perhaps do some follow-up reading on your own. At the end of this talk, I'll give the references, the primary references I used in the preparation of this talk. Okay, so to begin with, I make a claim that all real-world ethical decisions are based on probability or uncertainty. And by saying real world, what I mean is I'm excluding simplistic, hypothetical ethical dilemmas where uncertainty is eliminated. An example is the trolley problem, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Trolley going down a track, might hit 5 people, might hit 1. You have control of a switch, or another version of it. You're on an overpass and you can push a fat guy off the bridge and kill him, but save 5 people. Those two versions actually lead to very different decisions on the part of most people. Push the fat guy version, people don't like to do that. They feel that's wrong. But throwing a switch to kill 1 guy instead of 5, people are for the most part pretty okay with that. But that's sort of a toy problem in the sense that uncertainty has been eliminated from it altogether. In the real world, if you were driving your car, say, and an emergency arose, you had to swerve left or right, and swerving left might hit 1 person, swerving right might hit 5. Nothing is certain. It's possible that if you swerve left towards the 1, he'll jump out of the way and nobody will be hurt. Likewise, it's possible if you swerve towards the 5, they're more alert and they might all get out of the way. You don't know that. But in these kinds of problems, these ethical dilemmas, that kind of uncertainty is basically eliminated. But when you make your real world ethical decisions, that uncertainty is never eliminated. Okay, so just some background I'm going to give here. I'm going to talk about 2 areas of ethical decision making. One I refer to as public ethical decisions, decisions made by government, by corporations, by doctors, by academic science. And what sets these apart from what I'll call personal ethical decisions are that these decisions are generally documented and they're open to outside review. Whereas personal ethical decisions, such as, will I behave honestly in a certain situation? Will I engage in self-sacrifice? And the trolley problem is an example of a personal ethical decision. You're going to make a decision and it's possible no one else will ever know what your decision was. So in public ethical decisions, probabilities are often explicitly calculated. That is, for instance, in academic science, when you publish a journal article, you use statistics, you explicitly calculate probabilities, and you make a decision as to whether to accept one hypothesis or another based upon how those probabilities come out. So I won't get into how that's all done, but most of you are familiar with the idea anyway. in medicine and trying out new drugs before they're approved by the FDA, again, there's lots of probability involved in determining the harm versus the good done by a drug. And that's why drugs are tried on sample populations, and the effects of those drugs, both good and bad, are carefully documented. On the other hand, for most personal ethical decisions, individuals usually deal with uncertainty by simply making a rough probability estimate. If you're not sure what's going to happen when making one decision versus another, you usually don't calculate any probabilities. You simply say, what's more likely to happen here? So in the trolley case, am I more likely to kill one person? Am I more likely to kill 5? What's likely to happen? But you've all been faced with plenty of ethical decisions like that, where you're not sure what to do, and the right decision really depends on the likelihood of the various outcomes. So we'll come back and talk more about that in a moment. I'm also going to talk about 2 kinds of uncertainty in ethics. There's outcome uncertainty, and that's what I've been talking about up till now. Outcome uncertainty simply refers to the likelihood of any particular result once you make an ethical decision. Outcome uncertainty is the easiest to understand because it's used all the time, particularly in public ethical decisions, but it also plays a role in private ones, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's another type of uncertainty I want to talk about, and I call this engagement uncertainty. And if you look that up on Google, you won't find it because I made up this term. So, should I or should I not engage in an ethical dilemma? Before you're ever faced with one, you often have a decision. Am I going to do this action? Am I going to put myself in the decision of having to deal with an ethical dilemma, or am I going to avoid it? And there are lots of examples of this. A very simple personal one is, let's say you're going to go out to lunch with a friend. And this is not a good friend, but somebody you like, but they have a flaw. They tend to be very gossipy, and they tend to be very negative about other people sometimes. And you don't like that. You'd rather not have to deal with that gossip. Now you have some choices. You can simply avoid putting yourself in the dilemma of having to listen to this and react to it by not having lunch with a person. And that's avoiding the ethical dilemma. Or you can go to lunch and you can say, I really don't like the way you talk about people. I wish you would stop doing that. And that might be the ethically right thing to do, but it might have consequences. The person might react in a very negative way. You might lose a friendship. Or you could go to lunch and simply not react to the gossiping, try to change the subject, play along. The risk you run there is of playing into the gossip and becoming part of it, which again is an ethical result you might not be happy with. But again, uncertainty surrounds all of this. Now, engaging in an ethical, well, actually, there are a couple other examples I wanted to mention before I get into the next point. In public decision-making, there are also these opportunities to engage or not engage. Let's take politics. If you don't like the idea of the way politicians have to operate, compromising sometimes against your own ethical views in order to cause some good to happen, one way to deal with that is simply avoid politics. Don't get into it. Never run for public office. Stay away from any political situation. And lots of people do just that. But if you do go into politics, then you're faced with the second point under engagement uncertainty. If I engage, will I do the right thing or won't I? And you don't really know for sure in advance, no matter what your ethical point of view is. You don't know what kind of compromises you'll be asked to take part in. So that's another case of engagement uncertainty. And it gets even bigger than that. Take the case of choosing whether to enter a war or not. We're dealing with this right now with the war in Ukraine. Should the government help the Ukrainians? Now, we could have avoided it altogether, just stay away from the problem and let the rest of the world handle it. Or we could engage, which is what we've chosen to do, but only up to a point we've chosen. We'll send them weapons, we'll give them aid, we'll give them public support, but we won't send troops. Not yet, anyway. That would be the really big commitment. Anyway, these are all ethical dilemmas that involve engagement uncertainty and not just outcome uncertainty. So, dealing with engagement uncertainty can often be stress-inducing. And let me show you a little cartoon as an example of that. Okay. I don't know if you can read that. Can you read it? Yeah, I guess you can read it. I've been getting annoying pangs of conscience when faced with ethical dilemmas. Got anything for that? The doctor's advice will probably be, well, don't engage. Then you won't have to face an ethical dilemma. Okay. Finally, I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches to ethics. And probability plays a role in each of these in slightly different ways. I'm going to talk, first of all, about act consequentialism. Most ethical decisions in the public domain involve act consequentialism. That is, in evaluating a new drug, you look at what are the consequences of using this drug versus another drug or no drug at all. And you look at the outcomes and you can actually calculate probabilities of harm being done or good resulting from prescribing a drug or introducing a new drug. So most public ethical decisions, with an exception or two I'll talk about, involve act consequentialism. And I'm going to go into that subject in more detail in a moment. Then there's rule consequentialism. That's a little different in that it's still outcome-based, as is act consequentialism. You're still looking at the outcomes of your actions, but in making your ethical decisions, you're not treating every decision in an ad hoc way and doing a fresh analysis of each new situation. Rather, you have a set of rules you've established, and you apply those rules in ways that determine what you should do. And again, I'm going to say more about that later. Then finally, there's deontology. Deontology really means your duty. Kant has the most famous deontological system. And that's where you basically have a set of rules, but the outcomes don't matter. If you believe lying is wrong and you're a strict deontologist, then you're not going to lie, period. And it doesn't matter whether good results from not lying or bad results from it. A deontologist would say, lying is wrong, I'm not going to lie, period, regardless of the outcome. That's what separates deontology from rule consequentialism. Okay. Next. I want to talk in more detail about act consequentialism. All ethical systems of this type, such as utilitarianism, which is a more mathematical approach to act consequentialism, determine if an action is ethical based on the expected outcome of the action. And there's some important words in there. Expected outcome is important because what an act consequentialist does, particularly a utilitarian using utilitarianism, you make your decision based on assigning probabilities to the outcomes you think can occur, then taking the expected value of those probabilities. That is, you multiply each outcome, which can be measured in some way, by its probability, sum them up, and that's the expected outcome. In utility theory, it's the expected utility, where from an ethical point of view, expected utility is based on some measure of good versus bad. I won't get into details on that because there are whole books written on that subject. What's the best way to assign a goodness measure in any ethical situation? So, since few outcomes are certain, probability plays an important role in evaluating any action. And I think that's fairly clear. We all know in the real world, there are very few certain outcomes as a result of any action. There are multiple possible outcomes, and no one of those outcomes is certain. So most public ethical decisions, as opposed to private ones, are almost always based on expected outcomes in one form or another. Assessing the risk in an automobile. Automobile companies make ethical decisions regarding airbags, for instance. That was a big debate many years ago. Automobile manufacturers didn't want to put in airbags because it was costly. But the lack of airbags resulted in lots of deaths. Putting in airbags reduced those deaths, but it increased cost. And so prior to government action, each automobile manufacturer had to make their own decision as to whether to put in airbags or not. But because it was not an easy decision for companies that are profit-based to make, eventually it was the government who made the decision for them. And the government did a careful assessment of what the good would be resulting from introducing airbags against the harm being you're having to pay more for your car for the most part. But there are lots of other situations like this. I've mentioned testing drugs, using statistics in academic research. These are all public decisions that look at expected outcomes. But there are a couple exceptions. Let me give one exception. Abortion policy, in some states at least, is an exception to policy based on expected outcomes. Abortion policy decisions in many states are much more deontologically based. That is, it's simply wrong to kill a fetus, period. And there are state governments that have taken that point of view and hence are working hard to try to abolish abortion altogether. Outcomes don't matter. Yes, the mother might die as a result of an abortion. And yes, some other bad things might happen. This child might be raised in a homeless environment and turn out to be a criminal. So there's no guarantee that forbidding abortion is going to lead to good outcomes, but many state governments take the view that that doesn't matter. We, the state, know what's right and wrong for you, and we're going to decide. So that's really an exception to that second point I have up there. Okay. So this is an important point. Based on the importance of determining expected outcomes, research in making public ethical decisions is really a moral duty. In other words, gratuitous ignorance is unethical. It's unethical not to try to get answers to the question of what effect is this going to drug going to have on the population? What's going to happen if I put this feature in my car, like self-driving, for instance? Is that going to lead to more harm than good or not? So research is not only necessary, but it's unethical not to do the research up to a point, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So does this necessity of doing research, necessity of gathering information, does this also apply to private ethical decisions? I'm going to argue it does in a way, but here's another little cartoon for you. Take a look at this. Okay, so Alice, I know you didn't mean to do anything wrong, but would you have known you weren't supposed to do that if you'd read the code of conduct? Were we supposed to read it? So staying ignorant is, as I say, unethical. Now this is a partial exception to this rule. And this thing that's called the precautionary principle. And if you look that up on Google, yes, you will find it there. I didn't make up this term. This quote I have here comes from a United Nations resolution from 1992. And it was with respect to the environment. So it was known in 1992 that action to save the environment might be necessary. And they came up with this statement: where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. In other words, yes, you have a moral duty to do research, find out as much as you can. But in some instances, even if you don't know enough, you're obliged to act. A more recent example is the COVID epidemic. This was a clear case of application of the precautionary principle. So things were really bad with COVID. People were dying. Something had to be done. So yes, the government put in mask mandates. They put in distancing regulations. You know everything the government did. We all lived through that. Well, that was all an example of the precautionary principle. They didn't know yet whether masks really helped that much, but it would have been irresponsible to do nothing at all, to not take any action, even though there was a lot of uncertainty about whether masks help, whether social distancing helped, whether any particular drug helped or not. So prior to the introduction of the vaccine, there were a lot of government decisions made that were based almost entirely on this precautionary principle. And because it was a precautionary action, or the series of actions were precautionary in the lack of full data, there was some, no doubt about it, but not complete data. That led to a lot of controversy, which we're all aware of. Okay, so let me go on. That's act consequentialism. And as it pertains to public ethical decisions, it's pretty clear how probability plays a role. But even in private ethical decisions, because of uncertainty, it is fairly clear. So if you're a consequentialist, whether an act consequentialist or what I'm about to talk about, a ruled consequentialist, outcome uncertainty plays a big role. So in this kind of system, one selects general ethical rules to follow. Rule selection is based on the expected consequences of using that rule, not just in one situation, but across all situations. That's what differentiates rule consequentialism from act consequentialism. Okay. Rules are selected so as to produce the best outcomes in some sense. But in what sense? A lot of these systems differ in how they define what best really means. Examples are best is in applying my set of rules, it will result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's a fairly common criterion. But in many communities, that's not the criterion that's used. Another one is greatest good from my end of my community. And that community can be defined narrowly or broadly. In some areas, it's just your family, your relations that count. Might be your friends and relations. Or it might just be your country versus some other country. But some ethical systems and some individuals use that second one, greatest good for the community, as opposed to greatest good for the greatest number. In the US, we do that all the time. There are lots of policies we could adopt that would help the world as a whole at the expense of costing our economy something, and even costing each of us individually something in the way of higher taxes, in the way of fewer opportunities, perhaps. But the government generally makes its decisions based on what's good for the US, not so much what's good for the world. Now, lots of exceptions to that, of course. We entered World War II, although not until a majority of people believed that it was good for the US to do that because we had been attacked. Before that, there was a huge amount of debate whether it was good or bad to enter World War II. Anyway, so, but there are other examples here. Another one I want to talk about is a little different. It's a way of using probabilities that's different than looking at the highest expected outcome or the highest expected utility in utility terms. And that is minimize the maximum possible harm to those affected. And that rule is sometimes used in drug trials, for instance, in saying that rather than looking at just overall, do I get a better result using this drug over here or using a different drug? But if you look at it from the point of view of determining the maximal harm that could result from that drug, let's say death. Let's say you've got a drug that cures a disease for 95% of the population who use that drug. But because of allergies and other factors, it kills 5% of the people. Now, I could do expected utilities, and I could assign a utility to death and a utility to being cured of a disease. And because the vast majority of people get cured, it might turn out that the expected utility for using that drug is higher than not using the drug, despite the fact that 5% of the users of that drug die. But it's very unlikely that a drug like that would ever get introduced because you're not minimizing the maximum possible harm to those affected. Rather, you want to find a drug that minimizes death, even though it might not be quite as efficacious as another drug. So you introduce a drug knowing that, well, only 1/10 of 1% of the population is going to die from this drug, and it's going to give a pretty good cure to the rest. It's not going to cure as many as the drug that kills 5%, but it'll do a pretty good job. Well, that's the drug that'll get introduced rather than the one that kills 5%. So that's an example of using a different criterion other than expected utility. Okay, that's rule consequentialism. So how does probability affect this kind of ethical system? Outcomes are still uncertain. So probability still plays a big role, just as it does in act consequentialism. It just plays that role in a slightly different way. You're not looking at the expected utility of any one single decision, but you're looking at the expected utility, or the good versus the harm caused by applying a general rule to the general population. But there's another area here that is a little tougher to deal with. The optimal ethical decision applying any rule or set of rules may depend on the probability that others in the population accept that same rule. So I won't go into detail on the prisoner's dilemma, but I think most of you know what the prisoner's dilemma basically is. Two guys are in jail for a crime. They're separated from one another. Each one is offered a deal. You spill the beans and implicate the other guy, and you'll spend a year in jail. You don't talk, and the other guy talks, then you're going to spend 10 years in jail. If you don't talk and the other guy also doesn't talk, then you'll both spend 2 years in jail. And that's a famous problem in game theory. Some people look at that and they say, well, it's obvious. You talk. Because if I talk, I'll get either a year or I'll get 2. I'm sorry, I'll get either, let me state that again. If I talk, I'll avoid 10 years in jail. I'll get 1, but if the other guy talks, that's the outcome I forgot to define. If you both talk, you get more time than if just one of you talks. And that's critical, actually, to understanding the prisoner's dilemma. So if you both talk, you get more time than if only one of you talks, but you get less time than if you both talk, than if only one of you talk. I have a feeling I'm not saying that right, but anyway, you can write a matrix that shows these various payoffs. But the point is, not talking is altruism in the sense of treating your fellow criminals. You're doing something that might cost you, but in a certain sense, according to your own ethics, that's the right thing to do. You know, and in fact, that rule is pushed hard in criminal populations. Omerta, you know, the mafia rule of you never talk, period. And that's why there's such strong negative consequences in criminal organizations for spilling the beans and talking. In fact, that's become such a common way of viewing things that even in non-criminal populations, particularly younger people tend to follow that rule. Well, yeah, I know who's robbed that store, but damned if I'm going to say a word about it to anybody. You know, I may go and take some action against the person who robbed that store because I don't think they should have done it, but I'm not going to tell the cops about that. Anyway, so that's the tricky thing about using any set of rules. You gotta have some idea of how likely it is that anyone else is going to use that same rule. And that assessment is probabilistic. You don't know for sure one way or another. You've just got to make your best guess. That brings up game theory, and it brings up the idea of altruism and whether altruism is a good idea or not. There's been a lot of debate as to whether how altruism evolves in the human population. And it all goes back to these kinds of considerations. So anyway, that's That's rule consequentialism. Final one, the third one, deontology. Okay, so that term comes from a Greek word, deon, meaning duty. There are certain duties you're required to serve regardless of outcomes. Actions are good or bad according to a clear set of rules. Some acts are wrong even when they would have the best available consequences. So as in the trolley problem, and there's another one I'm going to talk about, the lying to Nazis problem. In the trolley problem, a deontologist would say, throwing a switch to intentionally kill somebody is bad, period. So I'm not going to throw a switch. I'm just going to sit back and let the trolley do what the trolley will do. The lying Nazi problem is the one where, during World War II, you're hiding Jews in your basement, and the SS comes, knocks on your door, and says, "Are you hiding anybody?" And if you're a deontologist and you think that lying is wrong, then the correct ethical decision is to say, "Yes, I am." On the other hand, if you don't lie, if you do lie and you say, "No, I'm hiding nobody here," you'll have violated your ethics as a deontologist, but no harm will come as a result of that. But to a deontologist, whether harm comes or not, to a really strict deontologist, whether a harm comes or not, doesn't depend on the outcome. Only depends on, did you do the ethically right thing? Now, I would argue that in this world, there are very, very few strict deontologists. Almost nobody's a strict deontologist. Almost everybody, to some degree or another, takes outcomes into account, and hence probabilities. So this just restates what I've already said. Consequences of actions have no ethical relevance. But if that's true, what does probability have to do with deontology at all? To a strict deontologist, outcomes don't matter. So where does probability come into play? Well, remember there were uncertainties I talked about. There was outcome uncertainty, and then there was engagement uncertainty. Well, engagement uncertainty still plays a role in deontology, because a deontologist can simply avoid putting themselves in the position of having to violate their own ethics. So that means during World War II, I never take anybody in, because if I do, I may be faced with an ethical dilemma. So I simply won't do it. Anyway, okay. Let me give some examples of deontological systems. Immanuel Kant has a well-known one, and many of ethical cultures' underlying beliefs are really based on Kant. He was a deontologist. He believed that reason could tell you what actions are right and which ones are wrong. And if you use your reason and applied the rules coming from your reason, and you're fine. But there's another one. 10 Commandments is another set of deontological rules, rules based on divine command. And that covers just about all religions. So most religious ethical systems are deontological in the sense that there's a set of rules you're expected to follow that conform to your religion. And if you don't follow them, you're a sinner, period. Another one, the Hippocratic Oath. I put in parentheses, do no harm. That's only a small part of the Hippocratic Oath, if you've ever read it. There's lots of other stuff in there. But do no harm is the way it's usually summarized. A doctor's primary duty in a deontological sense is to do no harm to their patients. Do whatever you can to help them, but never intentionally harm them. And finally, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot to do with putting the original set of human rights, the original declaration in place. So those are rules based on the inherent rights of human beings. And those are mainly deontological. You have a right to freedom, period, regardless of the consequences given somebody that freedom. And you can run through the set of rights and apply the same reasoning. Now, there are conflicts that can arise. So the Hippocratic Oath here for a doctor. Well, it's hard to completely follow the Hippocratic Oath. If the insurance that this person has tells them that they won't cover the treatment that will most help this person, such as a kidney transplant, for instance, doctors are in an ethical dilemma. Do they do it anyway and figure out later how to bear the expense of that? Or do they withhold that service, knowing that withholding a kidney transplant will result in the death of the individual? My mother had a good friend back in the 50s who died young, in her 40s, for exactly that reason. She had bad kidneys. A transplant would have saved her, but they weren't a rich family. They couldn't afford a transplant. So she never got one and she died. Anyway, okay. Let me go on here. Now let's talk about how probability plays a role in deontology. So although it's not outcome-based, many deontologists allow for exceptions to their ethical rules in those instances when strictly following the rules leads to bad outcomes. So back to that problem of facing the SS at your door. Many deontologists would say, well, yes, I'm lying, and yes, that's wrong. But I don't care, because the outcome in this case would have been so egregious that I can live with the lie I've told. Now, you're not being a strict deontologist when you say that. You're becoming something of a rule consequentialist. But if you look at formal discussion, write-ups on deontology, discussions of instances like the Nazi problem usually involve invoking some sort of probability threshold for a bad outcome, above which the general rule can be violated. So telling the truth to the Nazis at the door leads to such a bad outcome, both for you and for the people you're hiding, that if the probability of that happening is high enough, you will tell a lie. Now, obviously, whatever threshold you pick is somewhat arbitrary. There are extreme cases. A strict deontologist would say the probability of the harm resulting before I'll violate my ethics against lying. As I say, there are very few strict deontologists, and so you might invoke it. Well, if the probability is over 20% that harm is going to result to these people, then I won't tell the lie. I'll take the chance. Anyway, there have been various arguments about how to set a probability threshold and whether you should even do that. And again, we come back down to engagement uncertainty. You still have the option of not putting yourself in that position in the first place and not having to make a difficult decision. And that's what this last point is simply saying. uncertainty plays a big role in deontology because of that. So what's the probability of having to face an ethical dilemma? Now, you can choose not to face one, such as choosing not to hide anybody in your house. But in various situations, there's some probability that no matter what you do, you're going to face an ethical dilemma. And so you might make a judgment of that probability. And again, it'll usually just be a rough estimate. But going back to that really simple, going to lunch with a gossipy friend, you might go to lunch figuring that the probability that I'll be faced with a dilemma isn't that high, because I can steer the subject of the discussion in such a way that this kind of gossiping never comes up. Maybe I can do that. And so there's often some uncertainty in whether you're ever going to have to face an ethical dilemma. It's not always your choice. But the trolley pop is another example. Or let's make it a little more realistic. You're in a car driving down the road, and suddenly your tire blows out and your car veers, and you can run into some people or you can run into a building. If you run into the people, they get hurt, but you don't. You run into the building, you get hurt, they don't. You're faced with a dilemma and you had no choice of whether you were going to be faced with that dilemma. But by keeping your tires inflated, keeping your car safe, you can minimize the likelihood of facing that kind of ethical dilemma. Okay. So if you are faced with a dilemma, what you're really going to be evaluating there in an instant is subjective probability, not objective. You're making your own guess as to what's going to happen. And you have no real data to go on other than the instantaneous feeling that you got. You're going to get hurt or somebody else is going to get hurt. Okay. That's probability in deontology. So I'm actually coming to the end now. This is going to be a fairly short talk. So based on everything I've said, what should you do? Well, you should base your ethical decisions on the best available data and not on mere opinions or on your own emotions. I say as an individual, even for personal ethical decisions, you're obliged to have available to you the best data you can in making those decisions. So again, gratuitous ignorance is unethical. Now, sure, there are some instances where you're faced with a moral dilemma and you don't have the time or the resources to gather data. But in many instances, you do. What's the right thing to do during the pandemic, for instance? Well, I think a lot of us based our decisions on the best available data that we could find as to whether masking helped, whether social distancing helped, whether the vaccine really helped. But there were other people who chose to avoid that information. It was an inconvenience to deal with any restrictions coming from COVID actions. And hence, they just decided, I'm going to ignore all of that. I'm going to continue to do what I want to do. And I'm not going to make a point of gathering data. Or another variant of that, I'm going to be very selective in the way I gather data. There are only certain people I'll listen to, and I'm going to ignore everybody else. Okay, so given the inevitability of certainty, both outcome uncertainty and engagement uncertainty, you should know your probabilities to the best, as best as you can. You don't have to calculate them the way you would in utility theory. If you've ever looked much into utility theory, it gets very mathematical. There's a whole mathematical system built around it. But You should know it. You should come up with at least a good set of subjective probabilities based on the best information you have. They don't have to be exact, but they should be used to guide your behavior. So if you're an act consequentialist, just as I said, there are no strict deontologists. I don't think there are any. There are very few strict act consequentialists as it comes to personal ethical decisions. But if you are an act consequentialist, focused on the expected outcome for each of the ethical decisions you're going to make your best guess as to what's going to happen. And it's important that I say expected outcomes here, because there are two ways to look at act consequentialism. One is to say, I'll wait until after the fact, after the outcome, whatever it may be, and then I'll decide whether my decision was ethical or not. If good resulted from my action, then I did the ethical thing. If bad resulted from it, that was unethical. But that's actually the wrong way to look at ethics and at outcomes. It's critical ethically to make your best assessment of what's going to happen before the action. Making it post hoc is just a way to assuage guilt. Anyway, if you are an act consequentialist and you make your best decision and it turns out wrong, yeah, you'll feel bad about it. You'll have regret, but you'll still be able to say with a clear conscience, I did the best that I could based on the information available. So anyway, okay. For a rule consequentialist, focus on selecting rules that best expected outcomes across as wide a range as possible of the ethical decisions you may face. So you want rules that have broad applicability and that in a broad range of circumstances produce good outcomes. Not always the best. For a rule consequentialist, applying your rules might be suboptimal, but again, you can feel good about the decisions you made by applying a set of rules that you think in the long run lead to good outcomes across many ethical decisions, not necessarily in any one in particular. And finally, for a deontologist, it's a little trickier. Well, select those rules using your reason, if you're Kant, for instance, that you're most comfortable with across as wide a range as possible of ethical decisions you may face. So if you're religious and you read your Bible and you follow the 10 Commandments and all of the other rules put down by God in the Bible, as you're told, you'll be comfortable. Because regardless of the outcomes, you will have done what you think God told you to do. So that's an example of comfort here. Well, now that's actually all I've got to say. And I know there's a lot of things I didn't talk about, and we could spend a lot of time on any one of these points. But I had a set of references I used, and these were the four that I relied most heavily on. The Ethics of Chance was actually a dissertation from 1997 that I found in an obscure place on the web. The Ethics of Uncertainty is a fairly well-known chapter in a book. The book was published by the European Molecular Biology Organization, but that book deals very heavily with public ethical decision-making and how to deal with uncertainty. It doesn't deal with private decision-making much at all. The most technically difficult book is this next one, Probability in Ethics. It's, again, a chapter in a book, the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Probability. It's about 32 pages long, but it's densely mathematical. And it's a tough read, I'll have to tell you. Then the final one was, should we avoid or engage moral dilemmas? This came out of a publication in something called the Prindle Post. The Prindle Post is published by the Prindle Institute of Ethics, which is part of DePauw University, I believe. So that's an easy read. That's the easiest read of all of these. But it got fairly deeply into something that most of us don't think much about this idea of engaging or avoiding to engage ethical dilemmas. Okay, so any questions?
Before we get into questions, we are an all-volunteer association and get no funding from anyone else. So if anybody would like to contribute, please put it in the basket. And where's our mic for passive writers?